A gunshot. No warning, no screams, just one dry, final sound, tearing through a freezing February morning in 1934. Grant's farm fell silent. Not the silence of sleep, but the kind that arrives after everything is already over. High above the Missouri hills, the mansion stood heavy and sealed, built to protect those inside and shut the outside world away. Just after 8 in the morning, the chauffeur entered the bedroom, as he did every day. He turned on the radio. Music filled the room for a brief moment. Then everything stopped. August Busch Sr., the man who had just carried America's largest brewing empire through Prohibition, was dead. Beside him lay a small note. Not an explanation, not a confession, just a farewell to the people he still loved. Later, quiet whispers followed. Some said the physical pain had lasted for months, sleepless nights, strong medication. Others believed something else haunted him more deeply. The fear of losing control, of being trapped inside a body that no longer obeyed, a fate more terrifying to a man of power than death itself. None of this was ever proven, and the house never spoke. But that single gunshot did something history could not undo. It bound Grant's farm to death. Even though this place was built to celebrate success, to anchor power, to land, to make a dynasty feel permanent. So why did victory end here? Why did a man who survived Prohibition not survive himself? And what was it about this land that repeatedly watched powerful men rise, only to fall? If you want to follow the full story behind this place, take a moment to like this video and subscribe for what comes next. To understand that morning in 1934, you have to go back further than the mansion. Back to the land itself, before the estate, before the dynasty, before power believed it had no limits. The land before Busch. Before Grant's farm became associated with gates, mansions, and power, this land witnessed a very different story. A story that did not begin with victory, but with failure. The man connected to that chapter was Ulysses S. Grant. Today, Grant is counted among the figures who shaped modern America. He served as the commanding general of Union forces during the American Civil War, the bloodiest conflict in the nation's history, with more than 600,000 deaths, a toll greater than all other American wars combined up to that point. After the war, Grant became the 18th President of the United States at a moment when the country was fractured and desperately in need of repair. But that part of the story came later, much later. Before Grant became a national symbol, he was someone very different. Before his resignation, Grant was a professional officer in the United States Army. He graduated from the United States Military Academy at West Point, served more than a decade on active duty, fought in the Mexican-American War, and held mid-level command positions at remote frontier posts. The Army was the only profession for which he had received formal training. His identity, his income, and his social standing were all tied to the uniform he wore. In 1854, Grant resigned from the United States Army, not during war, but during peace. At that time, the American military was being sharply reduced. There were no major conflicts, no need for a large standing officer corps. In that environment, officers without political patrons and without influential family connections were considered expendable. Grant was one of them. He owned no property. He had no civilian degree. He had no network in Washington. All of his value was tied to an institution that no longer needed him. Internal evaluations from this period suggest that Grant was not viewed as a promising officer in peacetime. He did not excel at diplomacy. He was not skilled at self-promotion. He did not fit comfortably into administrative structures. At the same time, Rafizunning, another sound the Perbreki, Grant was repeatedly assigned to isolated frontier posts, cut off from stable social life and meaningful advancement. There were quiet whispers at the time that Grant drank more than was acceptable. There were no formal charges, no official disciplinary actions. These details exist only as rumor and were never confirmed by official records. But in a peacetime army, suspicion alone was often enough to end a career. Grant understood that clearly. The army would not keep him. And peacetime, America had no position waiting for a displaced officer. He left the military, not as a man formally dismissed, but as one quietly forgotten. After leaving the army, Grant attempted what 19th century American society considered the most honorable path for a man. He became a farmer. Through his wife's family, Grant gained access to approximately 80 acres of land near Whitehaven, southwest of St. Louis, Missouri. 80 acres equals more than 320,000 square meters, an area large enough today to hold an entire residential development. But in the mid-19th century, land did not guarantee prosperity, especially not in Missouri. The soil was hard and rocky. Farming depended entirely on weather. There was no irrigation system, no crop insurance, no safety net for failure. Grant built a small log cabin with his own hands. He did not hire builders. He did not design for comfort. He named it Hardscrabble. The name sounded almost humorous, but it was painfully accurate. Hardscrabble meant barren ground, land that resisted settlement, land that allowed survival but not recovery. Grant plowed the fields, planted crops, raised livestock, but season after season, nature refused to cooperate. Rain came at the wrong times. The soil failed to hold moisture. Crops died early. Grant had no financial buffer, no credit network, no ability to absorb risk. Small debts appeared, then grew larger. By the late 1850s, Grant had been pushed into a role rarely mentioned in later accounts of his life. He cut firewood, loaded it onto a wagon, and hauled it into St. Louis to sell in small bundles, just to feed his family. There were days when he stood on city streets waiting for buyers, while no one knew that the man selling firewood would one day command the Union Army. Some personal notes and peripheral memoirs refer to this period as one of deep discouragement. A few oral accounts suggest that Grant sometimes felt himself to be a burden. These details exist only as rumor, never formally documented, but they reflect the psychological pressure of the time. By around 1860, Grant was forced to abandon Hardscrabble. He left the cabin he had built himself and returned to live with his wife's family. Socially, it was a public failure. This land had watched a man attempt to live as an ordinary citizen and fail completely. Then, history shifted. In 1861 and 61, war erupted. America moved from peacetime surplus of officers to desperate shortage of men, willing to accept responsibility in chaos. Grant returned to the Army. What set him apart was not elegant strategy, but his ability to endure losses and continue forward when every option was bad. Within a few years, Grant rose from a forgotten former officer to commander of all Union forces. When the war ended, his name was inseparable from victory. That military reputation carried him to the White House. In 1869, second mention, Grant became the 18th President of the United States. He was elected, not because he was a refined politician, but because the country needed a unifying figure after division. During 2 terms in office, Grant focused on protecting the outcomes of the war, particularly newly established civil rights, and suppressing violent organizations that threatened post-war order. However, he struggled to control the civilian bureaucracy. Multiple scandals emerged around his administration, not because Grant was directly involved, but because he trusted people and failed to detect abuse of power. After 2 terms, Grant left the White House in 1877. He was not removed. He was not convicted. But his political standing had declined. When power left him for the second time, Grant entered a world he had never truly understood. Finance. And at that moment, the Missouri land, that had once witnessed his failure to live an ordinary life, was preparing to witness his final collapse. This land watched a future president fall before it watched an empire rise. Adolphus Busch. Power by design, The land in Missouri had already revealed one truth. A man with discipline, with honor, with effort, could still be crushed if he placed his entire life in the hands of land and fate. When Ulysses S. Grant left this land in failure, it did not disappear. It was not preserved. It simply remained, waiting for the next person to step into its gravity. That person was not a soldier, not a politician, and not someone who believed in luck. His name was Adolphus Busch. Adolphus Busch was born in 1,839 inches, Castell, Germany, into a family shaped by generations of trade. From an early age, he grew up in an environment where discipline, logistics, and calculation mattered more than reputation. His family did not teach him how to own land. They taught him how to move goods. In 1857, at just 18 years old, Adolphus left Europe, crossed the Atlantic, and arrived in the United States. He did not go to New York. He went to Saint Louis, a central transfer point in the American interior, where goods from east and west converged along the Mississippi River. This was not accidental. Saint Receobron Louis was the city where Grant once tried to sell firewood to survive, a place where circulation decided who endured and who disappeared. Adolphus did not begin by building factories. He began by watching. He worked as a clerk, as a bookkeeper, tracking the movement of goods, the flow of money, and the speed of exchange. He understood something Grant had never been positioned to learn. In a modern economy, power does not come from owning land, but from controlling flow. When his father died, Adolphus received a modest inheritance. Not enough to build an empire, but enough to choose a strategy. He did not buy land. He did not open a farm. He did not build a brewery. He sold supplies to breweries. Malt, hops, barrels, equipment. At the time, St. Louis was home to dozens of small breweries, serving the German immigrant community. They competed fiercely, but all of them depended on reliable supply. Adolphus did not need them to win. He only needed them to depend on him. This was the fundamental difference between him and Grant. Grant bet his life on a piece of land. Adolphus bet on system design. It was within this supply network that Adolphus met Eberhard Anheuser, a wealthy manufacturer, who had purchased a failing brewery. The brewery itself was unremarkable, but it had capital, and Adolphus had structure. In 1861, Adolphus married Anheuser's daughter. On the surface, it was a family union. In reality, it merged supply chains with production ownership. That same year, the American Civil War began. Adolphus enlisted. He did not distinguish himself as a battlefield hero, but the war gave him something else: a sense of national scale, of logistics under pressure, of how systems behave when pushed to their limits. After the war, Adolphus returned to St. Louis with a transformed perspective. He no longer wanted to sell beer. He wanted to remove beer's geographic limits. At the time, end quote, beer was a local product. It spoiled easily. It could not travel far. It could not sustain national distribution. Adolphus did not see this as a cultural boundary, but as a technical problem. He adopted pasteurization, a stabilization method still new at the time. He invested in ice-cooled railroad cars, allowing beer to travel hundreds, then thousands of miles, without spoiling. This was not a minor improvement. It was a structural reversal of the industry. Beer was no longer trapped in cities. It became a national commodity. In 1876, Adolphus introduced a new product. He named it Budweiser, a name with European resonance, marketed as an American symbol. Not a beer for elites, but a beer for the masses. Over the following decades, Anheuser-Busch surpassed all competitors. By 1901, the company was selling more than 1 million barrels per year, becoming the largest brewer in the United States. Measured by modern standards, This was a nationwide beverage operation, with continental-scale distribution. But Adolphus was not satisfied with market share. There are records suggesting he became increasingly preoccupied with permanence. Some private letters indicate, Ressajon Alon Sisiza, that he believed businesses could collapse, products could fade, but land endured. These details exist only in personal correspondence and rumor, never as public declarations. But they help explain a pivotal decision. At the beginning of the 20th century, Adolphus purchased the southern portion of land once associated with Ulysses S. Grant, not for agriculture, not for production, but to anchor power to a fixed place. Grant had tried to live on this land and failed. Adolphus chose another path. He did not live from the land. He used the land in Libertine II to declare permanence. From that decision, the idea of a palace began to take shape, not as a residence, but as a statement. And this is where tension quietly enters the story. Because when power is designed to last forever, it eventually demands inheritance, and no system fully controls what follows. August. Senior. When power collides with the body, power can be designed, but the human body cannot. The first member of the Busch family to confront that truth directly was August Anheuser-Busch SR. He was not the founder, he was the inheritor. Born in 1865, August Sr. grew up inside an expanding empire. Beer was no longer a local product. Anheuser-Busch had become a national system. When his father, Adolphus Busch, began seeking to anchor power into land, August Sr. was chosen to turn that idea into physical form. At the beginning of the 20th century, he received ownership of the southern portion of land once associated with Ulysses S. Grant. This was not accidental. That land had already crushed a future president. Now, it was handed to the heir of an industrial empire. In 1910 and in 1910, August Sr. began construction of a mansion on the property. Not a retreat, not a farm, but a statement of power. The building was completed in 1913 in the French Renaissance Revival style, inspired by the chateau of the Loire Valley. 3 main floors, more than 20 large rooms, 14 bathrooms, reception halls large enough to host national-level guests. Adjusted to modern value, this estate would be worth tens of millions of dollars today, but the mansion was not built to be lived in daily. It was built to endure. That same year, Adolphus Busch died. Formal power passed to August Sr., and almost immediately, the world around him began to turn. World War I broke out. German heritage, once a commercial advantage, became a political liability, but a far greater threat was still approaching. In 1920, the 18th Amendment took effect. Prohibition. The production and sale of alcohol were banned nationwide. For hundreds of breweries, this was a death sentence. August Sr. refused to let the empire collapse, and he redirected the entire system toward substitute products, malt syrup, bakers, yeast, soft drinks, ice cream, refrigeration equipment. There were no great profits, but the machinery kept running. Anheuser-Busch survived. For 13 years, August Sr. kept thousands of workers employed and prevented the brand from disappearing from public memory. This was the peak of his authority, and it was also when his body began to fail. By the late 1922, August Sr. suffered from multiple chronic illnesses: heart disease, gout, severe edema, constant pain, with no effective treatments available at the time. While he could still control the company, he could no longer control himself. Then, in 1930, another shock arrived. His grandson, only 13 years old, was kidnapped at gunpoint in St. Louis. The family paid a ransom. The child was released. There were no fatalities, but the sense of safety never returned. There are rumors among household staff and family acquaintances that after the kidnapping, August Sr. suffered from chronic insomnia. Some believe he began living in a constant state of vigilance, no longer viewing even his own mansion as a secure refuge. These details exist only as rumor and were never officially confirmed, but they appear precisely as his mental and physical condition worsened. By late 1933, his prohibition was officially repealed. Anheuser-Busch was among the first companies ready to resume beer production. From a business standpoint, this should have been a complete victory. But August Sr.'s body could not wait. By early 1934, his suffering had intensified. Movement became difficult. Sleep was fragmented. He depended on powerful pain medication. There are rumors that the family considered concealing the severity of his psychological decline, fearing that public knowledge could damage the brand's image. These accounts are unconfirmed and unsupported by official records. Then, on a February morning in 1934, everything ended. August Anheuser-Busch Sr. took his own life in the bedroom of the mansion he had built with a revolver. Beside him lay a brief note, no explanation, no accusation, only a farewell, addressed to his mother and his children. The coroner's jury ruled the death a suicide, resulting from prolonged illness. There was no extended investigation, no public scandal. A man who had outlasted prohibition, who had kept an empire alive, could not outlast his own body. Designed power had reached its limit, and the land that once broke Grant had now witnessed something else. An empire that survived, and a man who did not. Gussie. When power becomes a performance, after the death of August Sr. in 1934, Grant's farm entered a strange state. The mansion still stood. The land still belonged to the family. But power had left a fracture behind. The house was no longer a symbol of victory. It became associated with the collapse of a man, and it was in that vacuum that August Anheuser-Busch Jr. stepped forward. Born in 1899, Gussie grew up surrounded by wealth and expectation, but also by the memory of a father who could not outlast his own body. He was different from his father. August Sr. built power in order to endure. Gussie understood that power, if it only endures, will eventually be questioned. To last longer, power had to be shared as a feeling. That was the first turning point. Instead of sealing Grant's farm, Gussie chose the opposite path. He decided to bring power into the light. He began by testing imagery. The Clydesdales, not decorative horses, but heavy draft horses, tall, slow, and stable, each weighing close to a ton, moving with ritual, projecting strength without threat. In 1933, as Prohibition was repealed, Gussie sent a wagon of Budweiser beer, pulled by 8 Clydesdales, straight to the White House. This was not a commercial act. It was a performance of symbolic power. Beer was no longer a contested product. It became a sign that the country was normal again. And Gussie learned something crucial. The public does not need to know who owns power. They only need to be invited into the story. But this is where the story turns. In 1954, Gussie made a decision without precedent for a traditional power family. He opened Grant's farm to the public, free of charge. A private estate with a mansion, stables, and exotic animals was suddenly accessible to hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. Economically, this was not a profit model. In terms of power, it was decisive. Grant's farm was no longer the Busch family's home. It became shared memory. Children came to see animals. Families came to walk the grounds. Visitors took photographs with symbols that had once been distant. There are rumors among those familiar with the family that Gussie believed opening Grant's farm could soften the memory of his father's death. Others suggest he deliberately transformed the estate into a celebration to press down the darker atmosphere that had clung to the mansion. These accounts exist only as rumor and have never been officially confirmed. But the effect was undeniable. The public no longer saw the Busch family as distant figures behind gates. They saw them as part of everyday life. Power, when performed correctly, does not provoke resistance. It creates familiarity, and that familiarity became a buffer that would later cause mistakes to be viewed with less severity than they otherwise might have been. This decision changed everything. From the moment Grant's Farm opened its gates, the Busch family no longer possessed only power. They possessed public tolerance. And when consequences begin to soften, tragedy stops being an accident. It becomes a pattern. Privilege and consequences. When consequences are softened, tragedy does not end. It repeats. From the moment Grant's Farm opened its gates to the public, the Busch family was no longer seen as a distant power. They became familiar. They became visible in everyday life. And that familiarity began to change how society processed mistakes. The first fracture did not come from business. It came from within the family. In 1976, a name that had drawn little attention until then moved to the center of a tragedy. Peter Busch. Peter was Gussie's son. Born into privilege, raised in an environment where power always came with a protective buffer. That night, Peter was inside the main mansion at Grant's Farm. With him was David Lear, a close friend from Peter's private social circle, someone who regularly visited the house and attended personal gatherings. David Lear was not a member of the Busch family, held no position within the company, and was not a public figure. According to official statements, Peter was handling a loaded firearm and tossed it onto the bed. The gun discharged. David Lear was killed instantly. The scene raised multiple questions: distance, body position, the handling of the weapon. But the narrative quickly shifted. Peter Busch was charged with manslaughter. He pleaded guilty. The sentence imposed was probation, not prison time. One life ended. The consequence landed lightly. There is no legal documentation proving direct interference by the family or the corporation. However, within local legal circles, there were rumors that behind-the-scenes arrangements took place to avoid a prolonged and highly visible trial. These rumors were never confirmed and do not appear in court records. But for the public, what lingered was not legal detail. It was the pattern. But this is where the story turns. Because when consequences are softened once, they establish precedent. And that precedent, A team D10-10 telef, D10-10-10-10-10-10-10-10-10-10, does not stop with a single generation. In 1983, another name entered the story: August Busch, IV, Gussie's grandson. A fourth-generation heir, only 20 years old at the time. In Tucson, Arizona, August Busch IV left a bar late at night, driving his Corvette at high speed. With him was Michelle Frederick, his girlfriend at the time. Michelle Frederick was not part of the Busch family, had no connection to the company, and was not a public figure. Their relationship was personal, unrelated to business or formal power. On a curve known to be dangerous, the vehicle lost control and overturned. Michelle Frederick was thrown from the car and died at the scene. What made the incident disturbing was not only the crash, it was what followed. August Busch IV left the scene. He did not call for emergency help. He did not contact the police. He went home. When police later located him, quote, Newman Resen, he was injured, and claimed not to remember what had happened. There were signs of alcohol use. Empty beer cans were found in the vehicle. The investigation stretched on. Attorneys disputed evidence collection procedures. Time passed, rendering toxicology results legally meaningless. Ultimately, report and taxes passed. No criminal charges were filed. The official explanation was insufficient evidence. Once again, a life was lost, and the consequence did not reach its full extent. 2 years later, August Busch IV was involved in a pursuit with undercover officers. He was acquitted. There was no legal conclusion of favoritism or interference. But in the public mind, the picture was complete, not through a single piece of evidence, but through a sequence of events. This decision changed everything. The Busch family was no longer viewed only through the lens of success and celebration. They became a symbol of an uncomfortable question in American society. Does justice operate the same way for everyone? There is no document that concludes collusion, but there are patterns that records cannot erase, and those patterns prepared the ground for the final collapse of dynastic power. Because when tragedy carries no consequence, it does not end. It waits for the next repetition, a silent collapse. The collapse of the Busch dynasty did not begin with the market. It began with personal incidents that caused confidence in the heirs to quietly fracture. After a series of tragedies tied to the next generation, the Busch family was not publicly boycotted. There were no protests, no organized backlash. But inside the investment world, a far more dangerous shift took place. Long-term confidence in the family's ability to lead began to disappear. For the market, this mattered more than any scandal. But this is where the story turns. In the early 2000s, the global beer industry entered a brutal phase of consolidation. Century-old brands were no longer valued for their history, but for their ability to generate profit. And at that moment, a new force was ready. In Europe stood Interbrew, owner of Stella Artois. In South America stood Ambev, a Brazilian beer empire, known for ruthless cost-cutting. In 2004, Interbrew and Ambev merged, creating a new entity, InBev. From the moment it was formed, InBev became the largest beer producer in the world, by volume. Its strategy was explicit: acquire iconic brands, standardize operations, remove family control, govern by numbers. Meanwhile, in factions of Valaby and de Valaby, I was now like everybody percent I can. Anheuser-Busch still carried a dynastic structure. Power was fragmented. The family was divided into branches. Major decisions required consensus among people who no longer shared the same vision. At the center of this moment stood August Busch IV, a fourth-generation heir, and the last Busch, to hold executive control. He did not lack money. He lacked support. Investment funds looked at the recent past. They saw personal tragedies. They saw a distracted family. And they saw risk. InBev did not attack directly. They began with shares. Not a single massive purchase, but a series of quiet, incremental acquisitions. One fund at a time. 1 percentage point at a time. With each purchase, Alabakambaga's ran, the influence of the Busch family, shrunk slightly. No announcements, no public confrontation, but power was leaking away. By 2008, InBev had accumulated enough leverage to make a formal move. $52 billion US dollars. A number large enough to turn legacy into arithmetic. Adjusted to present value, it remains one of the largest acquisitions in the history of the global consumer goods industry. August Busch IV opposed the deal. Publicly, forcefully, did not, he called it, the end of a family dynasty. But the game was no longer his. The board of directors was no longer asking what the family wanted. They were asking what shareholders would gain. And then the most painful moment arrived. Several members of the Busch family voted in favor of the sale. Not out of greed, but because they no longer believed the dynasty could continue to control a global empire. This decision changed everything. One closed-door meeting, no raised voices, no public drama, just signatures placed on paper. More than 150 years of family control ended in a single day. Anheuser-Busch became part of InBev. The Busch family did not lose its wealth. It lost control. From rulers, they became shareholders. Grant's Farm remained open. The Clydesdales still paraded. Budweiser continued to appear. Across American culture, everything looked unchanged, but the dynasty was over. Not because the market was cruel, not because of a single scandal, but because confidence had fractured long before. No gunshot, no courtroom, just signatures, ending a family that once believed it would last forever. Today, Grant's Farm still exists. It is no longer owned by a global beer conglomerate, and it is no longer the private possession of a single individual. Grant's Farm is now managed by branches of the Busch family descendants, operating through a family structure that is fully separate from the brewing empire, now absorbed into the global market. The gates still open each day. The paths are still carefully kept. Electric trams continue to carry visitors across the fields. Children laugh as they feed baby goats. Families pose for photos near the Clydesdale stables, and couples walk into the mansion on the hill to celebrate their weddings. Few people mention that inside this same house, there was once a February morning that ended with a gunshot. There are no plaques explaining it, no signs drawing attention to what happened. Everything is kept pleasant and quiet. Some former employees quietly say that certain rooms inside the mansion are rarely used. Others claim that on certain nights, the house is completely locked, with no one allowed inside. There are no official records, no verified documentation, only stories passed from person to person, just enough to create the feeling that this place has never been entirely at peace. Grant's Farm today is no longer the center of an empire and flactors, but it still carries every layer of power, ambition, and the cost that came with them. This land once witnessed a future president fail, a dynasty rise, and then slowly lose control of its own story. Because buildings do not forget. People simply learn how to live above the echoes that remain. If you want to continue exploring other estates that once symbolized power, while hiding darker stories beneath their beauty, the videos on screen will take you further. If this story gave you something to think about, consider liking the video, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for staying until the end. We will see you in the next story.